Hello, everyone, and welcome to this module of the MA-HMA Oncology Pilot Educational Program. Today, we're going to discuss relevant guidelines, how they're organized, and what do they look like in the assessment. We'll cover principles of guideline development and procedures, and orientation on the most relevant oncology guidelines and other guidelines around them, and also how these are reflected in the assessment. Now, I haven't counted how many guidelines exist on our website, but it is a huge number. So you are invited to really explore, take your time to explore all of it, which is available there. Now, why are guidelines important? They are important because for several reasons, but let's say to start, they are mandated by legislation. In other words, the, the areas on which scientific and technical guidelines can and should be produced are described in the regulation and in the directive. And so this also makes it clear that the agency cannot produce guidance on any topic, but it has to be, let's say, uh, limited to the appropriate topics. Another critical concept behind the guidelines is really good administrative practices. In other words, a lot of drug regulation is not written in legislation. The criteria are very, let's say, high level, but when it comes to the practical implementations of how we assess criteria of quality, safety, and efficacy, a lot is left, let's say, to the interpretation. And the agency cannot, or let's say any public body making decisions for the public with impact on the public cannot be seen as arbitrary, and as much as possible has to strive to be transparent about the criteria it uses for its deliberations. And also, it cannot make up this criteria just on the go, so to speak, and as much as possible has to try to develop and justify its criteria. And to do so, it is very important that when developing guidelines, this is done in consultation with the public in a very transparent way to make sure that all possible viewpoints have been taken into account, etc. So you will not be surprised to see that behind the development of a guideline, there is a very systematic approach that ensures precisely this transparency. And it starts from selection of topics that have to be highlighted in the work program of the agency or the scientific committees, then a formal appointment of rapporteurs, a development of a concept paper, release for public consultation, and then as the guideline is drafted in its various iterations, there are repeated public consultation of this kind where comments are collected or workshops are organized to target specific stakeholders even, and then moving to the preparation of final guidelines, and then allowing for time to implement it and it's becoming operational. The whole thing may occur at the level of the European Medicines Agency and its scientific committees, or even either in sequence or in parallel with the ICH process, the so-called International Conference of Harmonization, where a number of regulatory and other stakeholders, members of this organization come together and agree on harmonized guidelines. And this process, as you can see, as you can expect, lasts several years. Here you have just an example of a timetable of a, what is it? A guideline adopted for the first time in 2018. So this just refers to, let's say, step steps 5 and 5 to 9, 5 to 10 of the chart here, and you can see it takes several years, several rounds of consultation, and so on. Now, some may say, "Oh, what are you doing? How can it be that such long time occurs in to draft guidance, which is often not longer than 10, 20 pages?" Well, agreeing on criteria is in fact something very complex, and especially in our let's say environment where there are even language barriers. Think at the level of ICH. Uh, it's extremely exciting to work on guidelines in that context, because you see really how different regions even word things. We are used to to use the word should in our guidelines. Well, it doesn't translate very well in all the languages, and in some languages when you say should, it's immediately translated into must, in others into nice to have, and you need to be able to agree on all these things. So it's a very exciting harmonization exercise, more than actually a cutting edge scientific exercise innovating a certain field. No, guidelines are more about consolidating practice, harmonizing the practice. So at ICH level, you will see a slightly different nomenclature for the different steps of consensus building and public consultation. They're called in steps, and but roughly the concepts are the same, and mimic the procedure in the different regions. When it comes now to the EU guidelines, these are, whether with an equivalent at ICH or not, these are all grouped under volumes. And today we are talking mainly about volumes 3 and 7, which are the scientific guidelines. But by scientific guidelines, I mean guidelines for interpreting the technical requirements for, or rather implementing the technical requirements for demonstrating quality, safety, and efficacy, and benefit risk in a marketing authorization application. But there are many other guidelines that go from regulatory aspects, clinical trial aspects, pharmacovigilance, and so on, that we will not discuss here. Of course, equally important and extensive. Now, not all guidances carry the same weight and the same, let's say, maturity of the topic. So there are three main type of documents. The first, which is the earliest in guidance development, is the concept paper. The concept paper is basically a plan to develop a guideline. So often it has a rationale, a problem statement, a scope, and a plan of, for example, who should be participating in the drafting of the guidelines, what stakeholders should be consulted, and when, and in let's say what format, and so on. So even on this, just the planning of a future guideline, there is public consultation sought, and often problem statements are slightly modified, and so on. Now, the second step in terms of how should I say it, maturity of the content, is the reflection paper. Here, if we go beyond acknowledging a problem, but perhaps explaining not a definitive regulatory perspective, but a viewpoint, a current thinking on a particular topic. So these are topics that are often newer, that require a relatively quick, let's say, regulatory input, emerging issues, novel development, or particularly controversial areas. And often this is the first step following the concept paper, just to communicate the current thinking, and then at a later step there will be a more definitive guidelines. And sometimes I remember we were actually developing a reflection paper in certain areas, and this is where it stops. And then we realize that actually even the thinking is too complex, and we had to kind of pull it back. So this is a very useful, let's say, regulatory communication, also to get input from the outside. And lastly, when the topic is fully matured, often this will be after perhaps years of already adopting opinions on a certain topic that was new at the time, but then a certain consolidated regulatory practice has developed. Well, the guideline is there to consolidate this into a single document to communicate. And these are as mature as it gets in terms of regulatory guidance, and really are intended to give, on one hand, companies, applicants, sponsors, guidance on how to plan product development, and to facilitate also the work of the assessors, who now have a principles and guiding principles to follow. Now, this is um, always general guidance that we're talking about. And what we're not talking about is a hugely important aspect of guidance, which is the individual scientific advice given on specific products or questions from individual companies or applicant of the advice. So often one of the things we try to avoid in these guidance is to say, well, on these issues you need to go for scientific advice, realizing that then the purpose of the guidance is defeated. You will still find it, for controversial topics in guidelines, this recommendation to companies to nevertheless seek scientific advice, but generally the purpose is to have advice that is generally valid. So this was the general introduction of how we generate guidance, the importance of a public process and transparency in generating the guidelines, and the different documents with different maturity of the contents. Now we turn the page to the oncology guidelines, and particularly the clinical and non-clinical guidelines in oncology. If today you are opening our website and have the patience to navigate to the right, and the luck to find the right page, what will you find? Well, it's relatively easy to find what we call the anti-cancer guideline. And this guideline has been recently revised, January 2024, and it has a number. It's probably the most relevant guidelines for anybody interested in clinical oncology development or assessment. And it contains a number of topics, both for exploratory studies, but more critically also for what we call confirmatory phase 3 studies, discussing what is the evidence for marketing authorization. And we've reviewed it many times. This is the sixth revision in 25 years. And believe me, if there is one section that has been on every occasion worked and reworked extremely carefully, is the section on endpoints for phase 3 confirmatory trial. So we will, in a minute, look at that section a little bit more in detail as an example of how to look at guidelines from different sources on a single topic, just to give you an idea what you find in these guidelines. But this latest revision also has a number of, let's say, more um, more current topics like novel study design, use of biomarkers, and other methodological considerations. Right, so this is the main body of the guidelines, about 40 pages, a read, which is a must for anybody interested in the field. Now, it is complemented by a number of appendixes. One is a methodological appendix on progression-free survival. There's a lot of discussion about this endpoint, not only about its validity, and is not addressed by this appendix, but by its reliability, how it's measured, blinded independent reviews or not, randomization, etc. So that addresses, it's the only truly methodological appendix here. The patient reported outcome appendix focuses on, especially on studies considering quality of life as an endpoint, and really forms a very positive, let's say, view of this endpoint to be studied as secondary endpoints, or when appropriate also as primary endpoint in certain situations. It's a very interesting and relatively recent guideline, partly written in response to the fact that EMA only had a very general guideline on PROs or quality of life that is rather, let's say, skeptical. It's just a listing of all the things that can go wrong, which are well known, but there is also a positive perspective on this type of endpoint in the right setting with the right methodology. And then there is an appendix which deals with condition-specific guidelines, again, talking about the same things: eligibility criteria, endpoints, etc., for non-small cell lung cancer, prostate cancer, and some hematological malignancies. There's also an addendum on pediatric oncology. It's an old one, but has some important information about eligibility criteria, performance status scales, etc. And then there are non-clinical guidelines and a pharmacogenomic guideline. So this is just a small subset of the guidelines listed in our oncology section, but it is the most relevant subset and probably, as I said before, a must read if you're interested in going further here. Now, let's now look more in detail at just one aspect. If you were interested then in looking at endpoints throughout our guidelines, where would you start looking and what would you find? Now, this is by no means comprehensive. It's just a taster of what you would find. Well, you'd probably start with the most high-level guidelines, and these are often the ICH ones, guidelines that have reached a level of harmonization where regions across the world and regulators and company organizations agree that these are the right criteria. So ICH 9 on statistical principle is a very good starting point for many methodological issues in drug regulation. And here we read that the endpoint to choose for a confirmatory trial is the primary variable, or so-called target variable or primary endpoint, and should be capable of providing the most clinically relevant and convincing evidence directly related to the primary objective of the trial. This is usually an efficacy variable and should be reliable, validated, and so on. So you get already an idea that choosing an endpoint is not a trivial task. You need to manage and balance a number of attributes: validity, reliability, tradition, feasibility, etc. Now, leaving that guideline and looking for something more detailed, at the level of the ICH, we will not find a clinical oncology guideline. So we are in Europe with the CHMP guidelines, and the main guideline that I was referring to you before will say that in its chapter on endpoint, there are a number of clinical endpoints considered as possible primary efficacy endpoints. Typically, these include overall survival, progression-free survival, and disease-free survival. Patient-reported outcomes, such as symptom control, are not excluded, provided that data quality is ensured. And in some situations, there are other endpoints listed which are possible. The chapter is much longer than these few lines, and there are all sorts of considerations expressed on when one or the other endpoints make more sense and so on. But deep down, it's a matter of benefit risk assessment, choice, balancing against one endpoint against the other using trade-offs. Now, assuming one is interested in progression-free survival, then looking at PFS, one, for example, could be interested in seeing how this endpoint is defined, and there are definitions used here, but they are practical definitions, not highly scientific of technical definitions, acknowledging that depending on the situation, there might be one or the other system that has been introduced in practice and is used in practice and might make more sense to use. But the guideline does specify what are the important criteria that all these systems need to have. This is the addendum on progression-free survival. Now, of course, the guidelines stopped at a certain point, and further level of details, like for example, on the classification, is either specifically mentioned in the guideline or is kind of assumed. So whatever is not specified in the guideline is subsumed to the existing standard textbook or published literature on the topic. And here one, for example, would refer to RECIST criteria in whatever is the applicable version for the disease to be used. Similarly, for PROs, if one were to look at the appendix, one would find recommendations on justifying why a PRO makes sense to be included, what type of claims could be made on this type of data, and yes, where it can be useful, further, let's say, reading or material to justify use. And again, the guideline stops at a certain point, and then one needs to, let's say, incorporate the existing scientific knowledge and regulatory practice. So when the guidelines stop advising, then what we are left is with the agreed scientific literature, the state of the art in the field, but also the recent regulatory actions, which are all documented in our public assessment reports. So that is the next step that one should follow in, let's say, exhausting what is known on a certain topic. There is also probably ongoing projects which have regulatory involvement. For example, the Innovative Medicines Initiatives used to be such kind of projects. So one would look at those sources of information, the published literature, ongoing guidelines being developed at the level of the agency or at the level of the ICH. And if we now look at the side of the guidelines, now we put ourselves in the shoes of an assessor assessing a marketing authorization application. There we have guidance on clinical assessment, and we have an indication of how, for example, endpoints should be described in terms of populations, treatment conditions, endpoints, time point for the measurement of the endpoints, intercurrent events, how to handle them, and sort of text advice on what are the important things that should be reflected in the assessment report and eventually in the EPAR and so on. And also how to describe the benefit risk assessment, how these endpoints should be reflected now, either in the benefit or the risks sections in a structure that you have seen in one of the previous sessions here. Just to give you some examples of what you would find in an assessment report, here we've taken really search for where guidelines were mentioned in non-clinical parts of the reports. You can see this here. And also there is not only reporting how the companies justify a certain approach to the data they submitted, but also how the assessor used the guidelines to either agree or disagree with the approach chosen by the company. So the guideline becomes, if you want, a useful benchmark in a number of relatively non-controversial cases on, how to assess a complex dossier if they are in agreement with the guidelines. That can really facilitate the assessment. Now, this is not always the case, and sometimes companies use guidelines actually to argue against an assessment of the company, perhaps claiming a different interpretation of the guideline. And an example here, which we'll find in an EPA on our website, the company argued that something was a pre-specified endpoint, therefore should be considered as a primary endpoint with all the inferential consequences of confirmatory studies, and the company and the CHMP disagrees with that. So guidelines can be used for or against, if you want, certain strategies. And there's also interesting EU case law where the CHMP this time used the guideline to say that now the evidence has changed, products approved on the basis of old guidelines no longer fit what is expected in the clinical context, and therefore argued to change their prior decision. And it's very interesting to read how guidelines are looked at in court cases. Again, the need, just because something is written in a guideline doesn't mean that it is a legally enforceable criterion. Criteria have to be scientifically valid and have to be documented with all the rigor, etc., of scientific evidence. I'm not going to go further in quoting this case law, but I just recommend it for you to read it, as it's very interesting. Because, as I was mentioning before, guidelines are so important because once you write down what you're going to do in a guideline, one also needs to stick to it. And so to appreciate that, I think it's interesting to look at how the courts will look at this. And I'm coming to the end of the presentation. The take-home message is a legal basis defines what are the areas where EMA can develop guidelines or should develop guidelines. These are considered as soft laws in the sense that deviations, if justified, are always possible. Just because something is in the guideline, it doesn't mean that it's required, but it does reflect current thinking, current practices, and requires justification in case of deviations. There is a large body of scientific guidelines, and you really will want to familiarize yourself, starting with the anti-cancer guideline that we've looked at. Guidelines should not be looked at in isolation. They should always be looked in the context of recent regulatory decision and what is the standard, the accepted scientific standards in the field. And lastly, transparent guideline development and transparency in general in all the agency activities is hugely important to ensure good administrative practices. And with this, I'm going to close, but before you close, perhaps some questions to generate some thinking even after the talk of today. As there are many regulators worldwide, we all produce guidelines in parallel. Not always we reach the level of harmonization of the International Conference of Harmonization. So what to do when there are different guidelines, how to advise companies. What if clinical guidelines, scientific guidelines from academia or learned societies conflict with regulatory authorities? Should we try to always align, or other mechanisms that we should use to communicate, justify divergences, and which are the best mechanisms? How to rely on the subsidiarity of standard scientific principle and practice. Yes, we can rely on textbooks, we can rely on what is generally known, but does this reliance always hold in clinical practice? And lastly, many of the guidelines take time, a long time to develop. This is justified in terms of the need for harmonization. Everybody has to agree, everybody has to be on board, otherwise a guideline is not very useful, and general agreement like this takes time. But what if we need to express our opinion on emerging topics that require a very rapid response? What other type of communications do we have, like scientific publications, letter to companies, where, let's say, transparency is not at the same level? How can we communicate meaningfully without violating some of the main principles on transparency? And with this, I close, and I thank you very much for your attention.